arrived at the house right around sunset. It was one of those places that you only see in movies, big, old, and full of charm. The kind of house that seemed like it had stories to tell, tucked away behind every corner. I was excited. I mean, who wouldn't be? Spending a few days in a famous painter's home sounded like a dream. His art was renowned, but after his sudden disappearance a year ago, the mystery surrounding him made this place even more intriguing. The long driveway leading up to the house was winding, surrounded by tall trees that rustled gently in the evening breeze. I parked my car and just stood there for a moment, taking in the sight. The house loomed in front of me, its large windows reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. It was beautiful, a little eerie, sure, but still breathtaking. As I stepped inside, it felt different. There was a stillness in the air, like the house had been waiting for someone to walk through its doors again. The first thing I noticed were the paintings. They were everywhere, lining the walls of the hallway, filling up the living room and even in the kitchen. Some were landscapes, others portraits, but all of them had this strange, almost lifelike quality. Like the eyes in the portraits were following me as I moved from room to room. At first, I brushed it off as an illusion, just the kind of trick your mind plays on you when you're in a new environment. But there was one painting in particular that caught my attention. It was hung in the study, a large portrait of a man staring directly out of the canvas, his eyes dark and intense. I remember standing there for what felt like minutes, just staring back at him. Something about the way he was painted, it was like he could see right through me. Shaking off the weird feeling, I explored the rest of the house. Everything seemed perfectly normal, cozy, even. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. Maybe it was the silence of the house or the paintings with their piercing gazes, but there was a heaviness in the air that made it hard to sleep. The first day was uneventful, just me settling in, getting used to the space. But something told me that this house had more secrets than I could ever imagine. And as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder, what really happened to the painter? That next morning, everything felt normal again. I convinced myself that the uneasy feeling from the night before was just my imagination, maybe a mix of exhaustion and being in a strange place. I made myself some coffee and spent the day exploring the town nearby. It was a quiet little place, nothing remarkable, but it felt good to be outside, away from the stillness of the house. When I got back that evening, the sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the front yard. As I stepped inside, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was this sense that something had changed while I was gone. I glanced around, trying to shake the feeling, but everything seemed to be in its place. That's when I noticed one of the paintings in the hallway. It was a landscape of a river, one I'd seen when I arrived. Except now, the angle seemed different. The river was still there, flowing through the same grassy banks, but it was as if I was seeing it from a new perspective. Maybe I hadn't looked at it closely the first time. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But then, as I walked into the living room, I saw it again. One of the larger portraits had shifted too. It was subtle, but the subject's gaze had moved. The man, who had been looking straight ahead the day before, now seemed to be looking slightly to the left, as if his attention had drifted. I stood there, staring at the painting, my mind racing. Could it have always been like that? Was I just imagining things? I walked around the room, inspecting every painting. The shift in the portraits, the subtle movements, it wasn't just my imagination. I could feel it in my gut. They were different somehow. The way their eyes followed me was no longer a trick of the light. It was real. The unease I'd felt the first night returned, but this time it was stronger. I tried to distract myself, but every time I glanced at a painting, it seemed like it had moved again. I felt like I was being watched, not just by one pair of eyes, but by dozens. I decided to take a closer look, moving from painting to painting, trying to convince myself there was some logical explanation. But as I reached for one, I swear I saw it. A flicker, just for a second, like something inside the canvas had moved. That's when it hit me. This wasn't my imagination. These paintings were changing, and they were watching me. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. I backed out slowly, my eyes flicking to each painting as I left, making sure nothing else moved. Once I was in the hallway, I felt a little more grounded, but the weight of what I'd just seen stayed with me. I needed answers. There had to be something in this house that explained all of this. The painter had vanished, sure, but no one disappears without a trace. If these paintings were connected to him somehow, I needed to know how. Maybe I wasn't just looking at art anymore. Maybe these were pieces of him trapped inside his work. I made my way to the study, the same room where that intense portrait of the man hung. There had to be something in there. Sketches, letters, anything that could shed some light on what was happening. I started digging through drawers, feeling a bit like an intruder. The air was thick, almost like the house knew what I was doing and didn't approve. After a few minutes, I found something. A leather-bound journal shoved to the back of one of the shelves. Dust covered the surface, like it hadn't been touched in years. I opened it slowly, flipping through pages filled with frantic sketches and cryptic notes. There were drawings of faces that looked eerily similar to the ones in the paintings around the house. The further I read, the more unsettled I became. The entries spoke of strange dreams, of hearing whispers in the night, and of something that the painter referred to only as the transfer. One entry in particular stopped me cold. It described the process of painting not just with brush and color, but with something deeper. He wrote about capturing essence, how he had found a way to trap life within the canvas itself. The words were scattered, disjointed, but the meaning was clear enough. These paintings weren't just art. They were prisons. The people in them, they weren't models or muses. They were souls somehow pulled into the work and locked away. My heart was pounding as I closed the journal. I couldn't believe what I was reading, but it all made sense. The shifts in the paintings, the way they seemed to move on their own, it was because they weren't just paintings. They were alive in some twisted, horrifying way. And the painter, he had done this on purpose. The realization hit me hard. If he had been experimenting with trapping souls in his art, where was he now? Could he have trapped himself? The thought made my skin crawl, but there was something even more terrifying lingering in the back of my mind. If the souls were still inside the paintings, what did they want from me? I stood there for a moment, clutching the journal, my mind racing. The house was quiet, too quiet. The silence now felt more like a presence, pressing in on me, as if the very walls were listening. I had to get out of there, get some air, clear my head. But as I turned to leave the study, I froze. From the corner of my eye, I saw it, a movement, slow, deliberate. One of the paintings in the study, the portrait of the man with the intense eyes, seemed to twitch. I whipped my head around, staring at it, heart pounding. His gaze wasn't just intense anymore. It had shifted. His eyes were no longer looking straight ahead but directly at me. Couldn't breathe. I could feel the weight of his stare, like he was trying to tell me something. Or maybe reach me. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. The air around me became thick, almost heavy. And then, from the living room, I heard it. A noise, a soft, shuffling sound, like something moving across the floor. I bolted out of the study, my feet carrying me faster than my mind could process what was happening. When I got to the living room, my worst fear was confirmed. One of the paintings, a portrait of a woman that I'd barely paid attention to before, was changing. Right in front of my eyes. Her figure, which had been standing in a garden scene, was now shifting, moving. Her head turned slowly, her painted eyes locking with mine, and her hand reached out from within the canvas, pressing against the frame, trying to push through. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. The whole room seemed to come alive. Every painting, the man in the study, the woman, the landscapes, they all started to twist and writhe within their frames, like they were fighting to break free. Panic surged through me, but in the midst of it, I realized something horrifying. The journal had mentioned the transfer. What if they weren't just moving? What if they were trying to escape, to switch places with me? The thought clawed at my mind. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint at first, but growing louder. It came from all around me, from every painting in the room. They were calling out, pleading, but their words were jumbled, desperate, like they were trapped in their own nightmare. I was frozen, unsure of what to do. But as I stood there, rooted in fear, something changed. The paintings stopped moving for a second, and then, out of the corner of the room, a figure started to materialize. It was no longer just within the canvas. It was stepping out. The white, ghostly wisp I had seen before, the one that looked human, now took a more solid shape, twisting into the form of a man. It was him, the painter. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his face blank, but his eyes, those same dark, intense eyes from the portrait, locked on mine. And in that moment I knew. He was trying to take my place, to pull me into his world, into the prison he had created for himself and all the others trapped in his work. The paintings weren't just alive, they were hungry, couldn't move. The painter's figure stood there, more solid now, his form no longer a wisp of smoke, but something real, something dangerous. His eyes bore into mine, and I felt the pull, the transfer that he had written about. My feet felt like they were sinking into the floor, the room around me twisting and warping. The paintings on the walls began to flicker, their colors shifting, the faces inside them growing more frantic, desperate, like they were aware of what was about to happen. I had to act. I couldn't just stand there and let it happen. I remembered the journal, the words scrawled across its pages. The essence must be captured in the act of creation. He had trapped them while painting. If that was true, maybe I could stop him. Maybe if I could destroy his work, I could break whatever spell he had cast on these souls. But there was no time to think. His figure stepped closer, his hand reaching out toward me. His fingers, pale and stretched, were inches away from my face. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I had to destroy the painting, his painting. Without thinking, I bolted toward the study where his portrait hung. The room was spinning around me, the house groaning like it was alive. Every step felt like a battle, the air growing heavier, pulling me back toward him. But I didn't stop, couldn't stop. I crashed into the study, slamming the door behind me. The portrait was there, hanging ominously on the wall, its eyes following my every move. His face in the painting had changed. Now it was twisted, a sneer of triumph on his lips, like he knew I was too late. But I wasn't going to give up. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a fireplace poker, and ran toward the portrait. My heart was pounding in my chest, every instinct telling me to run. But I couldn't leave this unfinished. I swung the poker with all my strength, smashing it into the painting's surface. The canvas tore, the sound like a scream, not just from the painting, but from him. As the canvas ripped open, the air in the room shifted violently. The figure of the painter, the one that had been reaching for me moments ago, let out a horrible wail. His form flickered, shaking violently as if he was being pulled back into the portrait. His hand, which had been reaching for me, began to fade, turning translucent once again. I kept hitting the painting, tearing it apart, piece by piece. With every rip, the room grew lighter, the pull on my body lessened. The other paintings, those trapped souls, began to fade as well. The faces in them relaxed, their frantic movements stilling, as if they were finally being released. And then, just like that, the painter was gone. The house fell silent. I stood there, panting, the poker still clutched in my hand, staring at the destroyed remains of the portrait. The weight that had filled the air was gone. The heavy presence that had haunted me from the moment I arrived had lifted. I don't know how long I stood there, just breathing, trying to process everything that had happened. The paintings were still now, just lifeless canvases. The souls inside them, the ones I had seen shifting and watching, were no longer trapped. I had freed them, but the house still felt different. Empty, yes, but in a way that left me with a chill, as if it was waiting for something or someone to return. Without looking back, I grabbed my things and left. I never told anyone what happened, and to this day, I wonder what might have happened if I hadn't destroyed that portrait. Would I have been the next one trapped in the walls, my face forever staring out from the canvas? All I know is, I'll never step foot in that house again. It all started off like any other house-sitting gig. Nothing special, just me. A cozy little place in the middle of nowhere, and a quiet few days to myself. The house was bigger than I expected, though 2 stories, lots of rooms, but it was nice. You know, one of those homes that feels lived in with little personal touches everywhere. Family photos, random knickknacks, that kind of thing. The couple who owned it had given me a quick tour before they left, showing me the basics. How to use the alarm, where the food was, and which rooms were which. Most of it didn't really matter to me. I was just there to take care of their cat and make sure nothing burned down. But then they mentioned something a little odd. They pointed to a door at the end of the hallway upstairs, the one leading to the last room. "We don't really use that room," they said, almost too casually, like it wasn't a big deal. "It's always been a little cold in there." I didn't think much of it at the time. I mean, every house has that one weird room, right? The one with the bad insulation, or maybe just some draft from an old window. I nodded, smiled, and forgot about it the moment they left. The first night was fine. Quiet, really. I spent most of it watching TV in the living room, half binging some show I wasn't really paying attention to. The house had this old, creaky vibe, but that's normal for a place this size. The wind outside was howling a bit, so the creaks and groans from the walls didn't faze me. It wasn't until I went upstairs to bed that I noticed it. The air felt heavier up there, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I chalked it up to the heat not reaching the upper floor as well, so I grabbed an extra blanket and didn't think twice about it. But as I settled in, that's when it started. At first, I heard just a soft thud, almost like something had shifted in one of the other rooms. Maybe it was the house settling or the wind rattling something loose. But then, it came again, louder this time. It sounded like something was moving, coming from that room at the end of the hall. The one they said they never used. I paused, listening closely, my heart starting to beat a little faster. It was a strange sound, almost like footsteps. No, that couldn't be it. No one else was here. The house was locked up, the alarm was on. I was just being paranoid, right? I got up, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I made my way to the door. I didn't want to admit it, but something about that room was making my skin crawl. The closer I got, the colder the air became, like the warmth from the rest of the house had been sucked right out of the hallway. I stood there, staring at the door for what felt like forever. Should I open it? Should I just leave it alone? My hand hovered over the doorknob, and that's when I heard it again. Clear as day this time. A single, slow step, like someone was standing on the other side of the door. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Whatever it was, whatever I thought I had heard, I wasn't going to stick around and find out. I backed away, quickly retreating to the safety of my room, telling myself it was nothing, just the house settling. But deep down, I knew. That room wasn't empty. I barely slept that night. Every little sound seemed louder in the dark, each creak of the house making my nerves stand on edge. But eventually, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the curtains. The house felt normal again in the daylight. Warm even. The weird, cold feeling from the night before had all but disappeared. It was almost enough to make me believe I had imagined the whole thing. But you know how it is. The moment you start convincing yourself something was just your mind playing tricks, that's when things usually get worse. That night, right on cue, the noises started again. I was downstairs, flipping through channels, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. I hadn't even realized what time it was until I heard it. The same soft thud, like something bumping into a wall upstairs. I froze, remote in hand, staring blankly at the TV, hoping I'd misheard. But then it came again. Another thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving from one side of the room to the other. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the house creaking like before. But deep down, I knew. It was coming from that room, the one they said they didn't use. The footsteps continued, steady and rhythmic, like someone or something was pacing back and forth. I felt my stomach drop, There's something unnerving about hearing movement where there should be none, especially when you're supposed to be the only one there. I got up slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. I had to check it out, right? I couldn't just sit there and listen to it all night. But as I made my way to the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor. What was I supposed to do? March up there and confront? What exactly? An empty room? The footsteps stopped, and for a second, the house was dead silent. But then, just as I thought maybe it was over, there was a loud bang, like something heavy had been dropped right above me. It was so loud, I jumped, my heart racing. No more excuses. I had to know what was going on. I started up the stairs, my legs feeling heavier with each step. The air grew colder again, the same way it had the night before, like the warmth was being drained out of the walls. When I reached the top, I stood in the hallway, staring at the door to that room. It was closed, just like before, but this time, I knew something was behind it. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. My breath was shaky, but I had to know. I gripped the knob and twisted it slowly, pushing the door open just a crack. The room was dark, shadowed in the dim light of the hallway. I could just make out the outline of the bed, a dresser against the far wall, but nothing looked out of place, except for the cold. It was freezing in there, like I had just stepped outside in the middle of winter. And then I heard it, a faint creak of floorboards, coming from the far corner of the room. My heart nearly stopped. There was something in there, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. I pulled the door shut as fast as I could, my hands shaking, and backed away. I didn't care what was causing the noise anymore. I just knew I wasn't going to open that door again. As I stood in the hallway, trying to calm my racing heart, I realized something. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't just pacing, it was waiting. The next morning, the sunlight didn't bring the same sense of relief it had before. The house might have been warm again, but that cold feeling stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about that room, about what might be waiting in there. I spent most of the day trying to keep busy, anything to avoid thinking about it. But as the afternoon wore on, I found myself drifting back to it, to that unsettling moment when I'd heard those creaks in the corner. I needed answers. There had to be an explanation, maybe something about the history of the house. That's when I remembered the couple had mentioned a box of old papers and documents about the property, something they'd tucked away in the study. I made my way there, determined to find something, anything, that would make sense of what I'd been experiencing. I rummaged through drawers, flipped through dusty folders, until I found it. A folder labeled Original Blueprints and History. As I opened it, something caught my eye, a letter yellowed with age. It wasn't addressed to anyone specific, just a handwritten note from the previous owner. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, and as I read the words, a cold chill washed over me. The letter mentioned the upstairs room. The owner had written about hearing strange noises, footsteps, voices, coming from that same room late at night. They talked about the freezing cold that would sweep through the house, how it always seemed to be concentrated around that one spot. But the part that really sent shivers down my spine was what they wrote at the end. There's something in that room. Not someone, but something. I don't know how it got here, but it's been there ever since the house was built. It watches. It waits. I sat back, the letter shaking in my hands. This wasn't just my imagination. Whatever was in that room had been there for a long time, and I wasn't the first person to notice it. The worst part? The letter mentioned that the room had originally been sealed off. The couple must have opened it up at some point, not knowing the history. That explained why they hardly used it, why they brushed it off as just cold. But it wasn't just cold. It was something else entirely. Something that had been disturbed when the room was reopened. I put the letter down, my heart pounding. Everything in me was telling me to pack up and leave, to get out of that house while I still could. But something kept me there, curiosity maybe, or stupidity. Either way, I wasn't going anywhere just yet. I spent the rest of the day avoiding the upstairs altogether. The air felt heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for night to fall. And sure enough, as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, that feeling of dread came rushing back. I tried to keep myself distracted, flipping through TV channels, but my mind kept drifting upstairs, back to that room, to the footsteps, to the cold. And then, just as the clock hit 11 o'clock, I heard it again. The thud, the footsteps. Only this time they didn't stop at the door. I swear, I could hear them moving down the hallway. Slow, steady, closer. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out the sound of the TV. But those footsteps, they kept coming, slow and deliberate, down the hallway, closer and closer. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to turn around to even look at the stairs. Maybe if I stayed perfectly still, it would stop. Maybe it would just turn around and go back to that room. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to stop. The air grew colder, like a breeze was blowing from the top of the stairs, except there was no wind, just that presence moving closer. I grabbed the edge of the couch, gripping it tightly, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. Then, I heard it, the unmistakable creak of the bottom step. Whatever had been upstairs, it was now downstairs with me. I turned my head slowly, just enough to see out of the corner of my eye. There, at the foot of the stairs, was a shadow. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't just a trick of the light either. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and it was moving slowly, deliberately, toward me. My breath caught in my throat. I felt like I was suffocating, like the air in the room had been sucked out. The shadow didn't make any noise, no footsteps now. It just floated, gliding closer, inching toward me. I stumbled back, my body finally breaking free from the grip of fear, but I had nowhere to go. The only exit was past that thing, and it was getting closer by the second. The TV flickered, the screen suddenly filled with static, and the lights in the house dimmed, almost like the power was being drained. I could barely see anything except for the shadow, growing larger, darker. And then, just as it reached the edge of the living room, it stopped. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to move, to run. But I couldn't take my eyes off it. The shadow shifted slightly, like it was aware I was watching, like it was waiting for me to do something. I took a step back, slowly, not wanting to provoke it. But as I did, the room grew even colder. I could see my breath now, fogging up in front of me. That's when I heard it, whispers. Faint, distant, but unmistakable, like they were coming from all around me. The shadow moved again, this time closer, its edges flickering like smoke. I stumbled backward, my body trembling, and that's when I saw it. The door. The front door was just a few feet away. If I could just make it there, I didn't think twice. I bolted, pushing past the icy grip of fear, my feet slamming against the floor as I made a dash for the door. The whispers grew louder, the shadow surging forward like it was trying to catch me. My hand fumbled with the lock, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely turn it. But just as I got the door open, I felt it. This cold, unnatural force pulling at me, almost like it was trying to drag me back into the house. I didn't look back. I yanked the door open and threw myself outside, slamming it shut behind me. The whispers stopped. The air outside was warm again, normal. I stood there on the porch, breathing heavily, staring at the door like it might burst open at any second. But nothing happened. The house was silent. That's when I realized it wasn't just in the room anymore. Whatever had been waiting up there was now free, and it wasn't going to stop. I stood there, panting on the porch, the warm night air doing nothing to calm the icy terror still running through my veins. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent now, like it was holding its breath. I felt like if I made any sudden movements, the door might swing open and that thing, that shadow, would come out after me. I needed to think. I needed to get out of there. But my car was still in the driveway, and the keys, they were inside on the table by the front door. There was no way I was going back in. Not after what I had just seen. I backed away from the house, my eyes never leaving the door, my brain scrambling for a solution. Maybe I could call someone, explain what had happened, but my phone was in the same spot as the keys, just out of reach. Typical. That's when I felt it. A shift in the air. The same cold I'd felt in the house was seeping through the cracks around the door, like the shadow was pressing against it, waiting for me to make a move. And then I heard it again, those faint whispers, barely audible but still there, like they were creeping under the door and out into the night. I couldn't stay out here forever, but there was no way I was going back in. Not alone. I remembered the letter, the one from the previous owner. They had sealed the room off for a reason, probably to contain whatever was inside. When the couple opened it again, they must have unleashed something. And now it was loose. Whatever had been trapped in that room was free, and it wasn't going to stop with just scaring me. Suddenly, the front door creaked. I froze. It didn't open fully, just enough to let out a sliver of darkness, like the shadow was testing its boundaries. My heart leapt into my throat. I needed to move now. I backed away from the porch, step by step, my eyes glued to the door. But the more I moved, the more the door opened, inch by inch. And then, just as I reached the edge of the driveway, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. Silence. Complete and utter silence. I stood there, my legs trembling, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing came. The house was still. No whispers, no shadows, no footsteps. It was like whatever had been inside had retreated, gone back to wherever it had come from, or was lying in wait. I didn't want to push my luck. I knew I couldn't stay. Grabbing what courage I had left, I sprinted down the driveway, away from that house, away from the darkness that had nearly swallowed me whole. As I reached the street, I turned back one last time. The house looked normal, like nothing had ever happened. The lights were off, the porch empty, but I knew better. I knew something was in there, something that would never leave. I didn't go back to the house. Not the next day, not the day after. I couldn't bring myself to even think about stepping foot inside again. When the couple called to ask how everything went, I lied. I told them everything was fine, that I'd enjoyed my stay, but deep down I knew the truth. Whatever I'd heard and seen in that room wasn't finished. And someday someone else would open that door, and they wouldn't be as lucky as I was. It was supposed to be just another easy babysitting job. You know, the kind where the parents leave you a list of emergency numbers, plenty of snacks in the fridge, and remind you to lock the doors. I'd done it 100 times before, but something about this house was different. Maybe it was the size of the place, way too big for a family of 3, or maybe it was the way the house sat at the end of this long, dark road with no neighbors close by. I showed up just before sunset. The parents were running late for some fancy dinner, so the mom rushed me through the basics. Dinner for the kids, bedtime routine, the usual stuff. But right before she left, she said something that stuck with me. She pointed to the landline phone in the kitchen, the old-fashioned one with the curly cord, and said, "Don't bother with that. It's disconnected." I thought it was weird, but, who uses landlines anymore anyway? Everyone's got a cell phone. The kids were easy. After dinner, we watched a movie, and by 9 o'clock, I had them in bed. I was alone downstairs, curled up on the couch with the TV on, mindlessly scrolling through my phone. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't mind. I liked the peace. It was nice after the chaos of watching kids all day. But then, right around midnight, the phone rang. At first, I didn't react. I mean, who uses a landline, right? But when it rang again, louder this time, I looked over at the kitchen. That disconnected phone was ringing. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. There was no way it could be ringing. The mom had said it wasn't even connected. I stared at it, my mind racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but it kept ringing, the sound echoing through the quiet house. I got up, cautiously walking over to the phone. It felt surreal, like I was in a dream or something. I stood there for a moment, staring at the receiver. It just kept ringing, shrill and insistent, demanding to be answered. Finally, my curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. I waited, but no one responded. Just this heavy, empty silence on the other end. And then, a faint whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. I pulled the phone away from my ear, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what I just heard, but whatever it wasn't normal. I hung up quickly, backing away from the phone like it might ring again any second. But it didn't. The house fell silent again. The only sound was the quiet hum of the fridge. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. It was just a prank, I told myself. Someone messing around with an old phone line. I went back to the couch, trying to focus on the TV, but every little noise seemed louder now. The creak of the floor, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and all I could think about was that disconnected phone, ringing out of nowhere. I told myself it was just a one-off, a fluke, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the end of it. I sat there, staring blankly at the TV, but I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to that phone. The silence that followed after I picked it up was creeping me out more than the call itself. And that whisper, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a prank. An hour passed, maybe more. The house was dead quiet, except for the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I kept glancing at the landline, expecting it to ring again, but it didn't. Just when I started to relax a little, thinking maybe it was just a weird glitch, the phone rang again. I jumped, nearly spilling the glass of water I'd been holding. The same shrill, old-fashioned ring echoed through the house, cutting through the silence. My stomach tightened into knots. I didn't want to answer it. Everything in me screamed not to pick it up, but at the same time I couldn't ignore it. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling heavy, and walked back into the kitchen. The phone sat there, innocently enough, ringing away as if nothing was wrong. But I knew better now. Something was wrong. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the receiver. Should I just let it ring? Maybe it would stop on its own. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. I had to answer it. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I had to. I picked it up again, my hand trembling slightly, and put the receiver to my ear. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. For a second, nothing. Just that same unnerving silence. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I could barely hear myself think. And then the whisper. This time it was clearer, like whoever or whatever was on the other end was closer now. I could make out a few words, but they were barely above a breath. The sound of it made my skin crawl, like it was right in the room with me, but I couldn't see it. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a chill down my spine. I yanked the phone away from my ear, slamming the receiver back onto the hook, as if that would stop whatever was happening. My hands were shaking, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I just heard. I backed away from the phone, my eyes fixed on it, waiting for it to ring again. But this time it didn't. The house was still, too still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I forced myself to move, to do something other than stand there in fear. I double-checked the locks on the doors, peering out the windows into the dark, empty yard. Nothing. Everything outside was calm and quiet, like it should be. But inside, the air felt heavier, like I wasn't alone anymore. I walked back into the living room, trying to shake off the dread creeping over me. I told myself it had to be some kind of prank. Someone messing with the lines, maybe tapping into the house. That had to be it, right? But the words kept replaying in my mind. "You shouldn't be here." What did that even mean? I settled back onto the couch, but this time I couldn't sit still. I kept glancing toward the kitchen, half expecting the phone to start ringing again. And every time I heard the faintest creak or groan from the house, my heart would skip a beat. There was something about that voice. It wasn't just a warning. It felt like a threat, and I had a sinking feeling this wasn't over yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every sound in the house, every creak, every gust of wind against the windows, felt amplified, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. My eyes kept darting back to the kitchen, to that damn phone, even though it was silent now. But the silence was almost worse. Felt like the calm before the storm. I sat there, hugging my knees to my chest, the TV just background noise at this point. Then, something caught my attention. It wasn't a sound this time, it was movement. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something outside the window. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind blowing the branches of a tree. But no, this was different. It was a shadow. I turned my head slowly, my pulse quickening as I strained to see through the darkness outside. The yard was dimly lit by the glow from a single porch light, but that only made it harder to see beyond the shadows. And then, I saw it again, clearer this time. Someone was out there, a figure standing just beyond the light's reach, watching the house. My breath hitched in my throat. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was one of the neighbors? Maybe it was just someone passing by? But something about the way they were standing there, completely still, made my skin crawl. It was like they were waiting for something. I got up slowly, my feet barely making a sound on the floor as I edged closer to the window. The figure didn't move. They were just standing there, staring. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no features, just this dark, looming shape. And then, just as I reached the window, the figure shifted. A step forward, barely noticeable, but enough to send a fresh wave of fear through me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. My mind was screaming at me to do something. Lock the doors, turn off the lights, hide. But I couldn't move, frozen in place by this eerie sense that something far worse was coming. And then, the phone rang again. I jumped, my pulse pounding in my ears. The sharp sound cut through the tension like a knife, and for a moment, I didn't know whether to be more terrified of the figure outside or the call inside. I backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on the door, and slowly moved toward the kitchen, where the phone was still ringing. My hand shook as I reached for the receiver, but I couldn't leave it unanswered. Not this time. I picked it up, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello!" The silence on the other end stretched out longer than before, like whoever or whatever was on the line was taking its time. And then I heard it. Not the faint whisper from before, but something worse. The sound of breathing, deep, deliberate, like someone was standing right next to me, exhaling slowly into the phone. I gripped the receiver tighter, my knuckles white, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. And then, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was clearer, stronger. "I'm closer now." I nearly dropped the phone, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I slammed the receiver down, backing away from the kitchen as fast as I could. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I turned back to the window, half expecting to see the figure gone. But they weren't. They were still there, closer this time, just standing at the edge of the porch, barely a few feet from the door. I stumbled back, panic surging through me. The house was locked, but that didn't feel like enough. Not with whatever was happening here. Not with someone or something so close. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. I needed help. I needed to get out of there. But as I glanced toward the front door, I realized the worst part of all. The lock on the door wasn't just unlocked. It was slightly ajar. Someone had been inside. My heart stopped. The front door was open, just enough for a sliver of air to pass through, the kind of gap that makes you feel like someone had left it that way on purpose. I was frozen in place, staring at the door, trying to remember if I'd checked it after the parents left. I thought I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it, but there it was, slightly ajar, like someone had slipped in unnoticed. The figure outside, the phone calls, the whispers. It all suddenly felt too real, like I was stuck in some horrible nightmare that was only just beginning. I wanted to run, to grab the kids and get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. I kept hearing that voice from the phone in my head. "I'm closer now." I had to move. I had to do something, but my body felt like it was in quicksand, weighed down by the growing fear that whoever or whatever had been watching me from outside was now inside. The house was still. Too still. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. Every breath louder than it should be. I slowly stepped toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached out to close it, trying not to make a sound. My fingers barely touched the doorknob when I heard it. Footsteps. Not outside. Inside. I froze, the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallway behind me. They were slow and deliberate, each step growing louder, like whoever was walking was in no rush, like they knew I wasn't going anywhere. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the hallway was empty. Dark, but empty. The footsteps had stopped. The only sound now was my own ragged breathing, the panic building inside me. I backed away from the door, my eyes scanning the room, every shadow suddenly feeling like it could hide something, someone. I thought about the kids upstairs, sleeping soundly, completely unaware of what was happening. I had to protect them. I had to get them out of there. But then, the phone rang again. That old, disconnected phone, shrill and piercing, louder than it had ever been before. My body jerked at the sound, and I nearly lost my balance. I didn't want to answer it. Not this time. I knew whatever was on the other end wasn't going to be a prank or a mistake. It was real. Too real. But the phone wouldn't stop. It kept ringing, echoing through the house like a countdown. With trembling hands, I picked up the receiver, my breath shallow. I didn't even say hello this time. I just listened. The silence on the other end was brief, and then the breathing started again. Slow, steady, and too close. And then the voice came back, low and sinister, like it was right next to me. I'm inside. I dropped the phone, stumbling backward, my heart racing so fast it hurt. The sound of the phone hitting the floor echoed in the silence, but I didn't wait for it to stop ringing. I bolted toward the stairs, my only thought being to get to the kids. I had to get them out. The footsteps started again, this time faster, like whoever was in the house was moving toward me. I could hear them, right behind me, gaining on me as I raced up the stairs. My legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I reached the top of the stairs, my eyes darting down the hallway toward the kids' room. The door was shut, thank God. But then, just as I was about to reach for the doorknob, I heard it, a creak behind me. I turned, slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. There, at the bottom of the stairs, stood the shadowy figure. I could barely make out any details, just darkness and a vague shape. But it wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the house, standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at me. The air felt thick, suffocating. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could move, but I had to protect those kids. I backed up slowly toward the door, trying to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever that thing was. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. I turned the knob and slipped into the kids' room, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I checked on them. They were still asleep, completely unaware of the danger just outside their door. I didn't know how long I could keep them safe, but I knew one thing for sure: whoever was in the house with us wasn't leaving anytime soon. I stood there, back pressed against the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The kids were still asleep, blissfully unaware of the terror unfolding just outside their room. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake them. The shadowy figure was still out there, just beyond the door. I could feel it, its presence lingering like a cold weight pressing down on the house. I looked around the room, trying to figure out what to do next. The windows. Maybe I could get the kids out through the windows, climb down to the backyard and run for help. But the windows were old and stuck. There was no way I could open them without making noise, and I didn't have much time. Suddenly, there was a soft tap on the door. My body stiffened. Another tap, and then a voice, low, slow, and deliberate. Let me in. It wasn't a scream, wasn't a shout. It was calm, almost like whoever or whatever was on the other side wasn't in a hurry. The voice was thick, full of malice, and it sent a chill down my spine. I pressed my hand over my mouth, willing myself not to make a sound. I could feel the cold seeping through the door, like the figure was just inches away. The taps came again, soft but insistent. I'm waiting. I felt trapped. I couldn't stay locked in the room forever. Whatever was on the other side knew I was in here, and it wasn't going to leave. I needed to act, but I was paralyzed by fear. The kids were my responsibility, and every decision felt like a gamble. The room grew colder, as if the figure's presence was invading, even without opening the door. I could hear faint whispers now, like the ones I'd heard on the phone, but they were closer, more insistent. It felt like the walls were closing in, the pressure building, making it harder to breathe. Then the doorknob rattled. It wasn't violent, just a slow, deliberate twist, like the thing on the other side was testing it. The lock held, but it wouldn't hold for long. I had to move. I had to do something. My mind raced as I scanned the room again. There was a small closet on the other side, but it wouldn't offer much protection. The windows were still stuck, and I didn't have anything to defend myself with. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. I knew I didn't have much longer. Just as I was about to make a desperate move toward the window, the sound stopped. Everything stopped. The rattling, the whispers, the tapping. All of it fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, I stood there frozen, waiting for the next sound, but it didn't come. Had it left? I leaned closer to the door, my ear barely an inch away, trying to hear anything. Any movement, any breathing. But there was nothing. The coldness still lingered, but the sense of immediate danger felt like it had pulled back, just a little. I exhaled, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever was out there had finally left. And then the phone rang. The old landline, the one that wasn't supposed to work, rang again, loud, shrill, cutting through the silence like a knife. I froze. I didn't want to answer it, but I knew I had no choice. Whatever was happening wasn't done with me yet. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone, not even bothering to speak this time. I just listened. The silence on the other end was heavy, like it was waiting for me to react. And then the voice came back, that same low, terrifying voice I'd heard through the door. You can't hide forever. I slammed the phone down, backing away from it like it might spring to life again. My body was trembling with fear, but I couldn't let it win. I had to get the kids out of there, and I had to do it now. I turned back to the window, ready to break it if I had to, when I heard it. The doorknob rattling again, harder this time, like whatever was on the other side wasn't just testing it anymore. It was trying to get in. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a lamp, and moved toward the window. My hands were shaking as I raised it, preparing to smash the glass, but just before I could swing it, there was a loud bang. The door flew open. I whirled around, expecting to see the shadowy figure standing in the doorway, but there was nothing, just the open door, creaking softly on its hinges. The hallway beyond it was empty, but the cold air had rushed in, filling the room with that same sense of dread. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They were moving away from the room, heading down the stairs. Leaving. For a moment, I couldn't believe it. Whatever had been in the house was leaving, just like that. But I wasn't about to wait around to find out why. I grabbed the kids, bundled them up, and ran. We didn't stop until we were far away from that house, far from the darkness that had crept inside. And I never went back. Not for the money, not for my things. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't finished. But I was.